What's up, guys? Welcome to the Modern Epistle podcast, where we equip believers to think theologically in a modern day culture. We're super stoked to be here with you all today. And our goal for today is just to kind of introduce ourselves and let you get to know us as your co hosts of the Modern Epistle podcast, but also just let you know how this whole thing came to be.
Yeah, so for those who don't know me, my name is Emil Haj. I'm 21 years old, and I'm originally from Southington, Connecticut. I'm a graduate of the Word of Life Bible Institute and currently a junior at Davis College pursuing a bachelor's in religious education with a concentration in biblical counseling. Over the course of my 2 years at Word of Life and now currently at Davis College, I've developed a passion for studying theology, but an even bigger passion for evangelism.
And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Dmitry Kolnev. I was born in South Russia before moving to Easton, Pennsylvania in 2002. I'm also a graduate of the Word of Life Bible Institute. I attended there in 2019, the winter of 2019 through 2020. I'm also a modern musician and composer. I go by the name Eric Steinson for my music name. And since my time at Word of Life, I've become very passionate for three things: being an advocate for the gospel, an advocate for theological studies, becoming kind of a ambassador for adoption awareness for adoptees around the world. I'm just so stoked to start this podcast, and I think there's no better way to kick it off than the way we're doing it now. So, Emil, could you kind of just take us through what got the podcast started for us?
In November of 2022, during my second and final year at the Word of Life Bible Institute, I started a social media ministry where I taught not just about, encouraging words and encouraging verses, but actually talking about various theological topics, going in depth, teaching people how to think theologically. It was a really good experience because it pushed me to learn a lot more about, the study of theology, the study of God, diving into the Bible, getting better at, hermeneutics, exegeting the texts. I got a lot better at that. And it was actually during summer break of 2023 where me and a couple of my friends did a podcast-like video, I'll just say, and we talked about apologetics, specifically about why we can trust the Bible and its inerrancy, as well as having a discussion on the issues that come out of Roman Catholicism. And it turned out really good. And that's when I reached out to you a few months later and was like, hey, I think it'd be really cool if you and I did it. Because I remember we talked about denominationalism.
Right, I was a guest on that podcast.
Right, yeah, you were a guest on that.
The three-parter, yeah.
Yeah, because I reached out. I was like, yeah, you want to be on this? And you're like, absolutely. Like, that sounds fun. And we talked about denominationalism and did what I didn't expect was us to do a 3-part series on that,
Yeah, it started as one, and I was always amazed, being a musician, I'm not huge in collaborations, and a co-host almost felt kind of the same way. And I remember kind of going into the first part thinking, I don't know how this is going to be, but it's funny how much or how easy it flowed for us, which obviously then the first part turned into 2 and then turned into 3.
Yeah, like it turned out really good, and I got a lot of good feedback from it. Mm-hmm. And within that 3-part series, I remember I didn't verbalize this thought, but I remember thinking, we could start a podcast specifically talking about the study of theology and teaching people how to think theologically in today's American culture. Because as anybody who knows me knows that with my videos that I make, again, I kind of mentioned this earlier, I don't like to just talk about basic common things about the Bible that most people teach on. Not that they're bad. However, if I were to do that, I'd kind of just fall into this loop of something that basically every other Christian social media influencer is doing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so I didn't want to fall into that. So I was like, you know what? I'm learning about various theological topics here at Word of Life.
Right.
I'm taking apologetics. I'm taking dispensationalism. I took Old and New Testament survey, theology 1 and 2. I took all those classes. Why can't I teach in depth as much as I can about those theological topics? And as I was going over this, and by now I'd already started my social media ministry doing those exact things, just getting more and more passionate about it. I remember thinking, I'm like, we can start a podcast. Was it me or was it you who first suggested doing a podcast?
I think I ended up kind of throwing that idea out to you, kind of half serious but half joking because of how well we were doing. Because I think at this point we were already talking about doing a second video together.
Well, a second series, I think, right?
Yeah, actually, because at this point, you're right. We decided the second video would be a series. And something that kind of amazed me was and I never verbalized this to you, but I almost used the second series that we did almost as a trial where to see how well we would not flow in a video because and in a discussion because that was already very apparent that we could do that, but how intentional could we be with the video? Not like we weren't intentional on the first video, but or the first three videos, but with coming up with questions and just being consistent in what we were
Yeah.
going to release. And yeah, I was just very much amazed. And yeah, I came to you and just saying, hey, maybe we should do a podcast. Like that would be fun. But again, I said it very casually. I didn't think
Right.
that any of this would come about. You were in school. I was in the middle of like, I guess I was just upheaving my life with so many things. I as much as I wanted to do it, I was kind of scared because I'm thinking I want to make sure this is something we can actually commit to and not just like, yeah, let's do it and then it never lifts up. I mean, to be honest, there was a few months that went by where we we were like podcast, yeah. Couple months went by, nothing was discussed about the podcast. I got so busy as we're like, let's do a podcast, and then life just fed us busyness. We were like, well, all right, I guess let's when it happens, it happens. But yeah, it's crazy how I mean, you and I were just I mean, we've been on endless calls about the podcast recently.
Right.
Something like this always sounds so complicated, it's almost scary, and it's so much easier than one might think to do a pod, especially when you have a co-host.
You want to talk about when you had said I'm a musician, I don't like to collab. However, I think with you and me, it feels like everything just fit like a glove with the time, just perfectly.
Yeah, it really did fit like a glove. I was just gonna say, I think if we chose a later date or an earlier date than what we did, it would have been a little tougher to have actually nailed this down.
Sure, yeah. I mean, we were doing podcast-like videos. I'm still doing podcast-like videos with others. Like
Right.
obviously this podcast is not quite official yet. However, I feel like just within the last week itself, you and I have come a long way with not formatting, but at least listing everything that we need and everything we want to accomplish. And with your management skills and leadership skills that I've seen over the last, almost 5 years that I've known you, I was really impressed with how you were able to quickly just, okay, let's get on this. Let's list this. What do we need for this podcast?
More of how that conversation went with making the podcast because I think that's something we said. We're like, we're already basically doing a podcast. Why don't we just make it an actual thing? Again, if we never did, I think if one of us came to each other without doing any of the videos together and said, hey, you want to do a podcast? I think both of us would have been a little more of a reserve to do it and more hesitation. And so I think it was really nice because we almost got to kind of dip our toes in the water before actually saying, all right, let's do it. And I remember sitting down with you when we were designing the logo. I was just so happy with your input. For those of you who don't know, and this is not a sponsorship or anything, if you're ever looking for logo work, canva.com is probably one of the best spots to go. And that's how we designed the logo that you see behind us. I just remember sitting down and we were FaceTiming or Zoom calling and being like, oh, this works. And I'm thinking, oh, this is great. You were very upfront with your opinion. You weren't like, oh, it's okay, when it really wasn't great. You were like, no, I think we could do better. And that's something I appreciate about you, which made me more excited was like you pushing me to get, I mean, both of us to just get almost that perfect logo for ourselves.
First, we created the backdrop, right? Or the background?
Yeah, we got the backdrop. Yeah.
Yeah, we first got the backdrop when we first sat down and talked about this, tried to design this. Typical Zoom call, share your screen type deal.
For those of you who think we're complete professionals, you couldn't be further from the truth. We're using Zoom right now. We're still working out the details of ways to do things. And I mean, if anyone's listening and has suggestions of like, oh, software and stuff, we're all ears. Absolutely all ears.
Yeah, for sure. Feel free to DM us. DMs are always open. So the plan is to get our podcast officially launched by the summer of 2024. This gives us a lot of time to learn about how podcast recording works. I didn't want to start by like the winter, like early to mid-winter or even late winter or even early spring because I'm in school. Classes are going to be a little tougher this semester because I got Gen Psych and math.
No
And
pressure there.
not to mention, here at Davis College, we also have snow camps 7 weekends in a row before spring break. So it's like that's also going to be a priority, ministry with that. And we just wouldn't have had the time when we discussed this together. I remember saying, you know what? What if we take the winter and the spring to just learn how podcast recording works,
Hmm.
and that way we can launch our podcast officially by the summer. So that's the goal for our podcast as far as when we're going to officially start and have it launched.
Yeah. What would you say is the overall goal of this podcast? What do you want listeners to really get out of not necessarily every episode, because I think every episode will be very either grouped together as a series, or they'll just be very individualized to a certain topic. But overall, what would you say you want listeners to get out of the podcast when they listen to us?
To teach people how to think theologically in modern day culture. What does that mean? Well, we want to go over specific theological topics that probably don't get talked about or taught in a regular Sunday church service. And that would include topics like dispensationalism, apologetics, soteriology, ecclesiology, etc. Now, some of you, if you're a seminary or Bible college student, you're going, yes. For those who are not seminary students, you're going, what the heck are those, like, what are those topics?
You lost them on the first one.
Right. And honestly, we want to teach on those things so that believers who go to church and probably don't hear their pastor talk about those topics in depth during a Sunday morning church service, we want to be able to teach those topics as we teach people how to think theologically. We want to include those complicated topics that don't get talked about so that people can learn, both Christians who are not seminary or Bible college students and Christians who are seminary and Bible college students.
I love how you said all of that. Yeah. People say the word theology and they get a little scared, they get a little nervous because
because they think of it as
what
a
do
men in suits type thing.
Right. And it's not like that at all. Theology, I mean, I again, being a musician, my students would always say this. They're like, I don't know music theory. It's always funny because I would tell them, I go, please tell me what is in a B flat scale. And like, oh, that's like the notes in a B flat. Oh, that's easy. B flat, C, D, E flat, F, G, A, B flat. They would play for me. I'd say, congratulations, you know music theory. And they'd always look so confused. Like, what? Like, it's more complicated than that, is it not? No. Like, it's really not. I tell you all this because the same thing is with theology. It's simpler than you think, and it shouldn't be this big scary word that you shy away. It should be something that you honestly long to dive into, and
Right.
that's really another goal of the podcast. Is we want you to fall in love with theology. We want you to grow in your faith. Theology can be fun. Theology can be exciting. It can be interesting. And
and it can be life-changing. It is life-changing.
Right. It is life-changing. And something we talked about too is kind of the three circles that we really want to hit is, theology, obviously, culture, and life. When I look at those three things, I really see all of those things grouped together. So we'll look at theology, but we're going to look at the culture back in the biblical times. We'll look, and then, we'll take culture in today's terms and say, okay, how does what's true now with today's society and life? I mean, day-to-day life, week-to-week life. I think something that sometimes is missed in theology, people are like, oh, theology, here it is, here's an explanation, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
But then there's no practicality to it. There's no, hey, this is how you can actually apply this to your life. And I think that's sometimes what is the cause of why a lot of people are like, I don't want theology, because how do I apply it? It's like,
right, because in order to apply theology, you have to know how to think theologically. Again, when you use those words, they think, whoa, Mr. Seminary student. That's not at all what theology means. It's not this men in suits. You can only pastors, scholars, theologians, and seminary students, and philosophers sometimes even, only they can do that, but theology is not for me.
Theology is something that any person can achieve in a discussion and in everyday practical life.
It's important to mention, too, theology is necessary for a believer to live out the Christian life. Why? Because what you believe ultimately determines how you, 1, behave, and 2, live your life. So here at Davis College, one of the classes that I took during this past fall semester was Pauline Epistles. And here's what I noticed throughout taking this class. The Apostle Paul addressed 3 things that I noticed. He taught in depth about various theological topics. He also taught people how to think theologically throughout their lives. And he also addressed the issues in the cultures of which his recipients were living in. But then, as I thought about what the Apostle Paul did throughout all of his New Testament epistles, teaching theology in depth, teaching people how to think theologically, and of course, addressing issues in the culture of which his recipients were living in, I thought that's what we're going to do in this podcast. How about we call our podcast the Modern Epistle Podcast? Because we're doing very similar things that the Apostle Paul did in the Bible. Yeah, we were honestly going to call this podcast Theology, Life, and Culture. That was taken. All these other names were taken. And I'm just like, what are we going to call this podcast?
It's funny because we ended up rearranging the words to come up with 3 different names and all of them somehow were taken. Right. I don't know how.
Yeah.
But it's funny because now that's become almost not the slogan, but almost a summary of what we'll go over in every episode. To be fair, Emil has most of the credit on the name. I woke up in the middle of the night because I never sleep through a night, and I saw a text from Emil and it said, it was like all caps. It goes, I got the name, I got the name, I got the name, I got the name. That's all I saw in the text because it was the kind of the preview thing. And I'm like, that's cool. I'm going back to bed. and
well, I remember. Keep in mind, I also had done this in the past, and then both of us, we got excited, right. And then I was like, yeah, no, it doesn't work.
Yeah, one of us was like, no, it doesn't work. Like, oh, okay. And so at this point, I'm like, yeah, right, he has it. Right, okay, we'll see about that. And it was funny because it really was the one. When he came to me with the name, I was like, that's perfect. It was honestly like almost a weight off our shoulders because we really wanted a name that would encompass who we are as Christians, but also what the podcast would be about.
Right. Yeah. No, I remember once and it wasn't even like this miraculous, I'll just say quote unquote miraculous way of figuring it out. I just eventually somehow it popped into my head. I was like, oh, yeah. In all of his letters, he talked in depth about theological topics. He taught people how to think theologically. And while doing that, he also addressed specific issues in the culture of which his recipients were living in. So why don't, if he did that in his epistles, we should call our podcast the Modern Epistle Podcast, because we're literally doing the exact same thing.
I mean, we're super excited. I mean, to just dive into the Bible with you guys and challenge not just you guys, but be challenged ourselves. I think that's the biggest thing. Like we're not sitting here with the stance of, oh, we have nowhere to grow. We're here to help you grow. No, like the growth starts with us. Even since we said, let's do a podcast, I think we've already seen growth in ourselves. If you told me a year ago that, I would be launching a podcast with one of my best friends, I would have laughed at your face, turned around, and walked away from you, shaking my head, thinking that guy's a lunatic. With this podcast, it's not just something where it's like, oh, it's just us talking, rambling about theology. When I tell you that we're going to grow with you guys, we're going to grow with you guys, especially with these guests that are going to be coming on. I mean, some pretty major heavy-duty topics and major guests will be on this podcast. You talk about Paul Weaver, for instance, who's, hopefully one day we can have him on this podcast.
I would love that, bro. Oh my gosh.
Absolutely. I'm just so stoked to do this with you.
For sure, bro.
And my prayer is that you guys would take in as much as possible through every episode and just with this podcast as a whole.
Well, I think that just about wraps it up. Again, this podcast will, Lord willing, be officially launched by the beginning of the summer of 2024.